worn-out waitress, a billionaire family that could buy the city, and one spilled cup of coffee that would change everything. For 24-year-old Anelise Parker, life at the Daily Grind Diner was a loop of clattering dishes, burnt coffee, and exhaustion. 6 years behind the counter had etched the scent of grease and desperation into her skin. Her polyester uniform was a second skin, her smile a mask. Every tip, every extra shift wasn't for her. It was for Daniel, her 16-year-old brother battling cystic fibrosis. His world revolved around inhalers, appointments, and hope. Hers revolved around him. On a gray Tuesday, the lunch rush hit like a storm. Anelise moved with practiced grace until the bell over the door chimed. The room fell silent. They didn't belong here. The Sterlings. Even if you didn't know their names, you knew their power. They walked in like royalty among peasants. At the center was Beatrice Sterling, a woman of 70 with diamond eyes and a voice that could silence a boardroom. Her cobalt Chanel suit shimmered against the diner's faded decor. Beside her, Richard Sterling, her son, CEO of Sterling Industries. His sharp features mirrored hers, but his gaze was all ice. Trailing behind was Catherine, his delicate wife, eyes darting nervously, and a stone-faced security guard who loomed near the door. The air thickened. Forks hovered mid-air. Conversations died. Even Gus, the diner's owner, stumbled over his words. "Mrs. Sterling, what an honor. We weren't expecting—" "Our driver had a flat," Richard cut in coldly. "Mother needed a place to sit." Beatrice's smile was calm, almost amused. "Nonsense, Richard. A change of scenery can be invigorating. A booth by the window." Gus waved frantically to Anelise. "Parker, you're up. Don't screw this up." Her pulse raced. The biggest table of her life and maybe the most dangerous. She straightened her apron, grabbed her notepad, and approached. "Good afternoon. Can I start you with some beverages?" she asked, voice trembling only slightly. "Hot water with lemon." Beatrice replied smoothly. "Black coffee," Richard muttered, already scrolling on his phone. "Just water for me," Catherine whispered, avoiding eye contact. Anelise retreated to the counter, hands shaking. This table could mean groceries for a week, or Daniel's next copay. She prepared each drink carefully, imagining the crisp bills that might follow. Balancing the tray, she returned, heart pounding. One drink at a time. Hot water before Beatrice. Water before Catherine. And then, she turned toward Richard. A child from the next booth darted past, chasing a toy car. He hit her leg hard. Time slowed. The tray tilted. The mug slid, spun, and crashed. Scalding black coffee splashed across Richard's tailored suit and across Anelise's arm. The sting of the burn made her gasp. Richard exploded. "You incompetent fool. Do you have any idea what this suit costs?" I'm so sorry, sir. It was an accident." Anelise stammered, her voice breaking. She grabbed napkins, desperate to clean, to fix, to breathe. Gus looked ready to fire her on the spot. Customers stared. The moment stretched unbearably. And then, Beatrice Sterling spoke, or rather she didn't. She stared. Not at her furious son. Not at the spreading puddle. But at Anelise's forearm. The sleeve of her uniform had been pushed back. The skin was reddened from the burn, but beneath it, faint and silvery, was an old scar. Beatrice's face drained of color. Her fingers trembled around the porcelain cup. Richard turned. "Mother?" But Beatrice didn't answer. Her eyes stayed locked on that scar, eyes that suddenly looked decades older, as if she were seeing a ghost. Anelise followed her gaze, confused. It's just an old burn, ma'am," she whispered. Beatrice's voice came out hoarse. "No, not just a burn." For a heartbeat, the entire diner seemed to hold its breath. Then Beatrice stood abruptly, her chair scraping the floor. "Richard, we're leaving," she said, "but your tea—" Gus began. She didn't hear him. She moved toward the door, her heels clicking like gunshots. Richard, fuming, tossed a few bills onto the table and followed. Catherine lingered a second longer, her eyes flicking to Anelise with something like pity. Then she too was gone. The diner buzzed again, whispers rising like smoke. Gus muttered something about bad luck and stormed back to the kitchen. Anelise stood frozen, clutching her burned arm. She didn't understand. But Beatrice Sterling's reaction, her fear, it wasn't about the spilled coffee. It was about her. Outside, a black car idled by the curb. Through the window, Anelise saw Beatrice turn in her seat and look back one last time. straight at her, a silent question in her eyes. A recognition, and for reasons she couldn't explain, Anelise felt the same shiver of familiarity crawl up her spine. That night, as she bandaged her arm and counted her tips, one thought wouldn't leave her mind. What if the scar she'd hidden her entire life wasn't just a scar? What if it was a map, not to treasure but to a truth powerful enough to destroy one of America's richest families? The mark was small, a crescent shape almost like a bird in flight with a single feather etched along its curve. Anelise had carried it her whole life, hidden beneath sleeves and silence. A birthmark she never thought twice about. Until now. Time stopped. The diner's clatter and chatter faded, replaced by a thick electric stillness. Beatrice Sterling, the woman who could silence boardrooms with a glance, was trembling. Her perfectly manicured hand rose, pointing at Anelise's arm. "That mark," she whispered, her voice cracking. "That mark. It runs in our family." The room gasped as if pulled into a collective breath. Richard froze mid-motion, coffee dripping from his ruined suit. Catherine's wide eyes flicked between her mother-in-law and the waitress, disbelief shadowing her face. Even Gus, the diner's gruff owner, stood rooted in place. Anelise looked from the faint scar on her arm to the billionaire matriarch who now stared at her like she was seeing a ghost. The shattered mug on the floor no longer mattered. Reality itself had fractured. Moments later, chaos rippled beneath a veil of control. The Sterling bodyguard, a man built like a statue named Samuel, then stepped forward. Without a word, he settled the bill, leaving a stack of $100 bills on the counter that could have paid the diner's rent for a month. "Mother." "This is absurd," Richard hissed as he guided Beatrice toward the door, his tone cold and clipped. "She's a clumsy waitress, not some long-lost relative. It's a coincidence, a tattoo perhaps. You're making a scene." Beatrice didn't answer. Her face, pale beneath the glow of the diner lights, was locked on Anelise. A strange mix of awe, confusion, and something dangerously close to hope flickered in her eyes. "What is your name, child?" she asked, voice steady but trembling beneath the surface. "Anelise," she whispered. "Anelise Parker." Beatrice repeated it softly as though tasting the name, as though it belonged to a memory long buried. "Anelise." Then she turned to Samuel. "Get her contact information. We will be in touch." And just like that, they were gone. The bell above the door chimed their exit, leaving behind the faint trace of Chanel No. 5 and a silence so deep it pressed against Anelise's ribs. Gus stared at the 5 crisp bills Samuel had left, his earlier rage evaporating into stunned reverence. "Take the rest of the day off," he muttered, eyes still on the money. Anelise didn't argue. She walked out in a daze, the sounds of New York reduced to a dull hum. The city moved around her, oblivious to the earthquake that had just torn through her small, ordinary life. Home was a cramped apartment in Queens, peeling paint, humming radiators, the scent of boiled cabbage drifting from the hallway, worlds away from the marble floors of sterling wealth. Daniel was on the couch, a textbook open, his chest rising unevenly as he struggled to breathe. When he looked up, his eyes, bright, intelligent, far too old for 16, filled with concern. "You're home early," he rasped. What happened? How could she explain that a billionaire matriarch had pointed at her arm and claimed her as one of their own? That a mark she'd hidden since childhood might somehow tie her to one of the richest, most secretive families in America? She couldn't. So she smiled instead, the kind of smile meant to protect him from worry. "Just a slow day," she lied softly. "How are you feeling?" He nodded, unconvinced. She brushed his hair back, trying to ground herself in the only thing that made sense. Him. That night, long after Daniel fell asleep, Anelise sat at the kitchen table staring at the faint mark beneath her skin. Could it really mean something? And why had Beatrice Sterling looked at her that way, not with disdain but with recognition? Sleep came in restless waves. The call arrived the next morning, a crisp British voice on the line. "Good morning, Miss Parker. This is Mrs. Sterling's personal assistant. Mrs. Sterling requests your presence at Sterling Manor in Greenwich this afternoon. A car will be sent for you." Anelise gripped the phone tighter, heart pounding. I'm sorry, what?" The woman's tone remained polite but firm. "Mrs. Sterling insists. The driver will arrive at noon." Then, click. The line went dead. Anelise sat frozen, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. She looked down at her arm, at that strange, crescent-shaped mark, and felt a chill crawl up her spine. Somehow this was only the beginning. It wasn't a question. Beatrice Sterling knew something, and that terrified Anelise. Panic wrestled with disbelief. This had to be a mistake, a coincidence, or the wild imagination of a lonely, wealthy woman. And yet, beneath the fear, a flicker of impossible hope. If there was even a chance this could mean something better, something that could change Daniel's life, she had to go. The same sleek black Bentley pulled up outside her building. The leather seats felt softer than any bed she'd ever slept in. As the car glided away from the gray streets of Queens toward the manicured calm of Connecticut, Anelise felt like she was leaving her old world behind, one cracked sidewalk at a time. Sterling Manor wasn't a home. It was a fortress of stone and glass rising from acres of perfect gardens, the kind of place that looked like it had secrets built into its walls. A tall butler with flawless posture led her through echoing halls lined with oil paintings and gilded chandeliers. The sheer wealth pressed down on her like a weight. She felt small, a smudge in a world polished to perfection. At last, she was ushered into a vast drawing room overlooking a private lake. Sunlight filtered through towering windows, catching the edges of crystal vases and velvet drapes. Beatrice Sterling sat by the fireplace, poised but unreadable. Richard stood by the window, arms crossed, radiating irritation. Catherine, his wife, perched nervously on the sofa, as if afraid to breathe. "Miss Parker," Beatrice began softly. "Thank you for coming. Please sit." Anelise obeyed, stiff and uncertain, fingers twisting in her lap. "My behavior yesterday was abrupt," Beatrice continued. "I apologize. But my reaction was not without reason." Her gaze dropped to Anelise's arm. "May I see it again, the mark?" Anelise hesitated, then slowly rolled up her sleeve. The faint silvery shape shimmered in the afternoon light, a crescent with a delicate feather curling from its curve. Richard scoffed. "Mother, this is ridiculous. It's a random birthmark. Millions of people have them. You're seeing ghosts." Beatrice turned to him, her voice slicing through the air like steel. "It is not a coincidence, Richard." She looked back at Anelise. "That mark has appeared on the women of my maternal line for over 2 centuries. It's called the Sterling Dove. My grandmother had it. I have it." She pulled back the cuff of her silk blouse. There, etched on her aging skin, was the same mark, faded but unmistakable. Anelise's breath caught. "It's identical," she whispered. Beatrice nodded. 24 years ago, my youngest son, Edward, and his wife, Laura, were lost in a yachting accident off the coast of Montauk. They had a baby girl with them. Her name was Juliet. The wreckage was found, but the bodies were not. Her voice faltered. "Juliet would be your age now. And Laura, my daughter, had the mark." The air thickened with disbelief. Richard turned sharply, anger flashing in his eyes. "You can't be serious. You think this waitress is Juliet? She's a fraud. Juliet died with her parents. This is some scam, a tattoo, a trick. Someone's feeding her information." Beatrice's tone hardened. "Enough, Richard. No, it's not enough," he snapped. "I won't watch you be manipulated. I am the CEO of this company, the guardian of this family's name. I will not let sentiment cloud your judgment." Anelise's voice broke through, steadier than she expected. "I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't even know who you were until yesterday. I've had this mark all my life, and I can't explain it." Her honesty hung in the air, raw and trembling. Beatrice studied her, the firelight reflecting in her eyes, then spoke with calm authority. "There is only one way to know the truth." The room went still. "Our family physician, Dr. Albright, will arrive within the hour. He'll collect DNA samples from both of us. The results will come from the most reputable lab in the country." Richard turned away, muttering under his breath, but Beatrice ignored him. Her attention was fixed entirely on Anelise. "If you are who I believe you might be," she said softly, "your life will change forever. If not, you will be compensated and bound by confidentiality." Her gaze was steady, unblinking. "Are you willing to proceed?" Anelise swallowed hard, the weight of 2 worlds pressing on her shoulders, the life she knew and the one waiting beyond that test. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "Yes." Anelise looked between Beatrice Sterling's hopeful face and Richard's cold, calculating glare. She thought of Daniel, of hospital bills, endless shifts, and the constant fear of losing everything. Whatever this was, it was a door. A terrifying, glittering door to a life she couldn't imagine, and maybe the truth about a past she'd never known. Her parents had died in a car crash when she was a baby. At least that's what the orphanage told her. She had no family, no history, only a mark. Yes, she said, voice steady. I'll do it. Richard's eyes narrowed. He didn't want her here, and Anelise realized with a chill, in this mansion, truth might be more dangerous than lies. The days after the DNA test felt like a waking dream. At Beatrice's insistence, Anelise stayed at Sterling Manor. It was framed as protection from the media should word leak out. But deep down she knew she was being watched. Her guest suite was bigger than her entire queen's apartment. Pale cream walls, silk drapes, a balcony overlooking emerald lawns. A housekeeper silently laid out designer clothes, cashmere, silk, leather. Each item cost more than Daniel's monthly medication. Anelise could call him once a day on a secure line. She told him she'd been offered a high-paying assistant job and would be living on site for a few weeks. Beatrice had already wired money into her account, enough to erase their debt. Daniel, thrilled, didn't question it. But every lie Anelise told felt like swallowing glass. Life inside the manor was a strange dance of warmth and suspicion. Beatrice treated her with cautious kindness, inviting her for tea in the conservatory or slow walks through the rose gardens. She asked about Anelise's childhood, her dreams, her brother, but never about the past. Never about the daughter named Laura or the baby called Juliet. It was as if she feared that saying the names out loud might make them disappear again. Anelise sensed the ache beneath. Her poise, a grief too deep to heal. Richard, on the other hand, was ice. He treated her with open contempt, his every word a jab wrapped in civility. At family dinners, he steered the conversation toward global finance or art auctions, topics designed to remind her she didn't belong. Catherine, his wife, remained silent, her sad eyes darting between them like a trapped bird. Even the house felt alive, ancient, beautiful and suffocating. The staff moved quietly, their expressions unreadable. Anelise often felt their eyes on her as she wandered the portrait-lined halls, like the manor itself was judging her presence. One rainy afternoon, restlessness led her to the west wing, a part of the house few seemed to enter. The air there was still and heavy with dust. At the end of the hall, a door stood slightly ajar. She hesitated, then pushed it open. Inside was a nursery, frozen in time. A carved wooden crib stood in the center, a silver mobile of tiny birds hanging motionless above it. Dresses hung untouched in a glass wardrobe. Storybooks sat pristine on a low shelf. Everything was coated in a fine layer of dust, as though the room itself had been holding its breath for decades. Then she saw it, a small leather-bound album resting on a rocking chair. The cover read, Our Juliet. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Photographs filled the first pages. A smiling couple on their wedding day. The man handsome, kind-eyed, unmistakably a Sterling. The woman radiant, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders. Edward and Laura, June 1999, read the handwritten caption. Anelise turned the pages. Photos of Laura's growing belly, her joy shining through each frame. Then, the final page, Laura in a hospital bed cradling a newborn swaddled in white. A faint crescent-shaped mark peeked from the baby's arm. Her mark. A strangled sob escaped Anelise's throat. She sank into the rocking chair, clutching the album to her chest. This wasn't a coincidence. These were her parents. That baby, Juliet, was her. She didn't hear the footsteps behind her until a voice cut through the silence. This wing is private. Anelise jumped. Standing in the doorway was Mrs. Davies, the head housekeeper, a stern woman with a face lined by decades of loyalty. I'm sorry, Anelise stammered. The door was open. I didn't mean to intrude. Mrs. Davies's expression softened slightly as her gaze fell on the album. That room has been sealed for 24 years, she said quietly. Mrs. Sterling couldn't bear to look at it. After the tragedy, it was as if a part of this house died. Anelise's voice was barely a whisper. She must have loved them very much. Mr. Edward was her favorite, Mrs. Davies replied softly. He wasn't like his father or brother, a gentle soul. He wanted nothing more than his wife and little girl, Her voice faltered, eyes distant with old memories. He and Mr. Richard. She stopped herself. But Anelise heard the weight in her tone. There was something between the brothers. Something dark. And as thunder rolled outside the manor walls, Anelise realized, whatever the DNA test revealed, this house held secrets far older and far deadlier than her birth. Mrs. Davies's eyes clouded with old memories. Mr. Edward and Mr. Richard never saw eye to eye, she said quietly. After their father, Mr. Gregory Sterling, passed, Edward wanted to take his inheritance and leave. Start fresh, far from all this. What happened? Anelise asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard fought him, Mrs. Davies replied. Said it would weaken the company, destroy the family's power. The arguments were terrible. The week before they left on that boat trip. She stopped herself, realizing she'd said too much. Her expression hardened back into professionalism. That was a long time ago. Old history. She took the album gently from Anelise's trembling hands and set it back on the rocking chair. The DNA results come tomorrow. Best not to dwell on ghosts until we know the truth. With that, she ushered Anelise out, closing the nursery door, sealing the past once more. Back in her suite, Anelise's mind raced. The brothers' feud. Edward's desperation to leave. It all cast a shadow over the official story, a tragic accident that suddenly didn't seem so simple. The next morning, the manor felt tense, suspended in silence. Dr. Albright was due to arrive at 3 with the certified DNA results. Every tick of the clock clawed at Anelise's nerves. This test would either confirm an impossible dream or end it. But while she waited, Richard Sterling was already at war. Convinced she was an imposter, he had hired Vincent Thorne, a discreet but merciless private investigator known for uncovering secrets people thought were buried forever. His orders were simple. Find dirt on Anelise Parker. Anything, a record, a lie, a scam, that could prove she wasn't who she claimed to be. Thorne was good at what he did. He dug through sealed juvenile records, foster care files, and old acquaintances. He spoke with former foster parents, neighbors, even co-workers. But the story he found was disappointingly dull. No crimes. No scandals. No hidden past. She was quiet, hard-working, fiercely protective of her younger brother. A woman who'd spent her life scraping by. Too honest to be a con artist, too poor to fake being a Sterling. Frustrated, Thorne changed tactics. If he couldn't find flaws in her, maybe he could find cracks in the story. He began investigating her birth. According to orphanage records, Anelise had been found as an infant on the steps of a church in a small Long Island town, left in a basket with a note bearing only her first name and date of birth. Thorne drove there himself, pulling the original police report from 24 years ago. It was short, an anonymous call, a baby abandoned outside the church, the note logged into evidence. Everything appeared routine, until he noticed a detail most would overlook. The report was dated October 26th. He cross-referenced it with the Sterling tragedy. The yacht Serenity had vanished during an unexpected storm on October 24th. The wreckage washed ashore on the 27th. The timeline was tight, but possible. Then something else caught his eye. A tiny sidebar in the local paper. A woman had reported her car, stolen on the night of the 25th. It was found, abandoned the next morning, near the same church where the baby appeared. Police had written it off as an unrelated local crime. Thorne didn't believe in coincidences. He tracked down the woman, now in her 80s. Her memory was sharp. They didn't take a thing, she recalled. Just used it. Left it clean. Except for one thing. The driver's side mat was covered in sand. And it smelled of salt, like someone had just come from the beach. The beach. Thorne's instincts sharpened. He dug back into the Coast Guard reports from the Serenity investigation. Most of the wreckage had washed up along a desolate private stretch of shore near Montauk. About 50 miles from the church, he drove there, the autumn wind sharp against the ocean spray, and found the retired Coast Guard officer who'd led the search. The old man remembered the Sterling case instantly. A real tragedy, he sighed. That storm came out of nowhere. We searched for days, but the currents here, they'll pull a body miles out in hours. We never had a chance of finding them. Did you find anything unusual? Thorne asked. The man hesitated. His gaze drifted toward the horizon, where waves crashed against the gray rocks. There was something, he said slowly, something we were told not to put in the final report. Thorne leaned forward. What was it? The old man's voice dropped to a near whisper. A second lifeboat. Smaller, half buried in the sand a few miles from the main wreck. It wasn't from the Serenity. We thought it might have belonged to a fishing vessel, but... He paused, eyes narrowing. There were baby clothes inside, clean, dry, like they'd been wrapped in something to keep them safe. Thorne stood silent, the waves crashing around him. He'd set out to expose a fraud, but now, staring at the ocean that had swallowed the Sterlings, he wasn't so sure who was deceiving whom. And back at Sterling Manor, as the clock struck 3 and Dr. Albright's car appeared at the gates, Anelise's world, and the family's, was about to change forever. There was one unofficial detail that changed everything. The yacht's emergency beacon, state-of-the-art, designed to trigger on impact or submersion, never sounded. When investigators examined the wreckage, they found the beacon intact, but its wiring had been cleanly severed. Cut wires, not the signature of a storm, sabotage. Vincent Thorne, hired to discredit Anelise, felt a chill. Someone had tried to make the Serenity disappear without a trace. While Thorne followed the ocean's dark footprints, Anelise discovered secrets in the house itself. She couldn't bear waiting in her palm-lined suite. Drawn once more to the west wing, she found the nursery door locked and beside it a small study that must have belonged to Edward. Canvases leaned against the wall. Charcoals and paint lay in careful disarray. In a back drawer beneath sketchbooks, a locked metal box caught her eye. With a hairpin and a few anxious minutes, the lock clicked. Inside, on faded velvet, lay a tarnished silver locket and a bundle of letters tied with ribbon. She opened the locket first. A tiny portrait of Edward. On the reverse, Laura. Her hands trembled as she untied the ribbon and read. The letters were not from Edward, but to him, written in elegant looping script by a woman named Fiona. The first began, "Dearest Edward," and brimmed with urgent warnings. "I cannot shake this feeling of dread," one read. "Your brother watches us. He sees Laura and the baby not as family, but as threats to what he believes is his birthright. He speaks of preserving the legacy. I hear only greed." Another, dated October 22nd, pleaded, "Do not go on that boat. Take Laura and Juliet and leave tonight. Disappear. I fear your brother." Annelise's blood ran cold. She rifled through the sketchbooks and found a charcoal portrait captioned, "Fiona, Juliet's governess, the only one I trust." Mrs. Davies had mentioned a governess who vanished after the accident. Now the name had a face. These letters were no idle gossip. They were a warning from the past, urgent and specific. Someone had feared Richard enough to beg Edward to flee. Sitting on the dusty floor with the letters spread around her and the locket clutched in her palm, Anelise understood the shape of the lie. This had not been a simple maritime disaster. It smelled of premeditation. The man who stood to gain most and the brother who had watched her with venom since her arrival now looked like a motive made flesh. The grandfather clock chimed 3. Dr. Albright had arrived. 2 truths hung in the air. The laboratory's sealed envelope downstairs and the yellowed pages in her hand. In the drawing room, tension was a living thing. Beatrice sat ramrod straight, her face composed but raw. Richard loomed by the fireplace, taut with hostility. Catherine hovered on the sofa, pale and small. Anelise stood near the door, the weight of the letters heavy in her pocket. Dr. Albright, a kind-faced man in his 60s, entered with a manila envelope. He cleared his throat, every movement professional, every second laden with consequence. "Good afternoon," he said. "I have the certified results from the laboratory. They are conclusive." He opened the envelope and scanned the pages before looking up at Anelise. "The mitochondrial DNA analysis shows a direct, unbroken maternal link between you and Beatrice Sterling. The probability that you are the daughter of Laura Sterling, and therefore Beatrice's granddaughter, is 99%. For a heartbeat, the room was a held breath. Then Catherine let out a small stunned sound and pressed a hand to her mouth. Beatrice closed her eyes. A single tear tracked down her cheek. Her trembling hand reached for Annelise's. "Juliet," she whispered, the name finally allowed into the open. The reaction from Richard was volcanic. "No, it's impossible," he snarled, voice snapping like a whip. "The test is wrong. She bribed someone. This is a setup. His accusation filled the room like smoke. Anelise stood silent for a moment, the letters in her pocket suddenly a different kind of proof. The charcoal pleas, the warnings about a brother who would not tolerate a threatened inheritance, the severed beacon wires. The web was tightening around one dreadful possibility. Beatrice's fingers closed around Anelise's. "You are my granddaughter," she said, voice small and steady. "Whatever comes next, we will find the truth." Outside the manor, Thorne stared at his own notes. Sand on a stolen car, a lifeboat half buried in Montauk with baby clothes folded inside, dry and preserved. The shoreline had whispered its secret. His findings no longer fit the tidy story of an accident. Inside, Richard paced like a caged animal. Denial and outrage warred visibly across his face. He would not easily yield control. Not to grief, not to science, not to a foundling who carried the sterling dove on her arm. Anelise folded the letters and slid them back into her pocket. She had expected one verdict, a test that might change her life. Instead, she held two truths, a name revealed by science, and a history of warnings that pointed toward something darker than fate. Whatever the DNA confirmed, the manor's quiet halls had already begun to echo with an accusation. Someone had cut the wires on the Serenity. The house waited. The family braced. And somewhere between the lab report and the inked pleas, the next move would decide who would survive the truth. "This is a fraud," Richard roared, his face flushed crimson. Dr. Albright's calm voice cut through the chaos. "The test is incontrovertible, Mr. Sterling. The laboratory is one of the most secure in the country. The chain of custody was perfect. The results are both legally and scientifically binding." "I don't care," Richard spat, his fury turning on Anelise. "You think you've won, don't you? You think you can just walk in here and take what generations of my family built? I will destroy you, girl. I'll drag your name through the mud until no one remembers it." "That's enough, Richard." Beatrice's voice cracked like a whip. Rising from her chair, the frail grief that had haunted her was gone, replaced by the iron resolve of a matriarch. "You will welcome your niece into this family, or you will find yourself outside of it. Juliet is home." That is the end of this discussion. Richard's chest heaved, his eyes burning with disbelief and hatred. Then, without a word, he turned and stormed out, the heavy oak doors shaking behind him. The revelation should have been a victory for Anelise, or Juliet Sterling as she now knew herself to be. But the letters she had found poisoned the triumph. As Beatrice embraced her, weeping with joy after 24 lost years, Anelise felt only dread. She was in the arms of a woman whose own son might have orchestrated the death of her daughter and son-in-law. But Richard Sterling wasn't a man who accepted defeat. His first call wasn't to his lawyers. It was to Vincent Thorne. The DNA was a match, Richard hissed into the phone. The old woman's lost her mind. "She's rewriting her will. That girl stands to inherit Edward's entire share. A fortune. What about my findings?" Thorne asked quietly. "The cut beacon wires. The stolen car." "This wasn't an accident, Mr. Sterling." There was silence, long and cold. "That's a complication," Richard said at last. "A complication that needs to be buried. Your investigation is over. Destroy the files. Forget what you found. Your final payment will reflect your discretion." Thorne said he understood, but he didn't. He had uncovered murder, and though he was a pragmatist, conscience still flickered beneath the surface. Richard's next move was more insidious. He began to isolate Juliet, weaving lies through the house and company. He whispered that she was unstable, greedy, damaged from her years in foster care. Staff were ordered to watch her every move. The grand estate became a gilded cage, then a blow to her fragile reputation. A valuable Fabergé egg vanished from the library display. Richard pounced, accusing Juliet of theft. Her room was searched under his command while she stood frozen, humiliated. Hours later, Mrs. Davies found the egg misplaced behind a bookcase. But the damage was done. Doubt had taken root. Even Juliet feared in Beatrice's heart. The serpent was striking, and Juliet knew she couldn't fight alone. Fiona's letters were powerful but incomplete. She needed the man who had already glimpsed the truth, the one Richard had tried to silence. Using a small burner phone from her old life, she began to dig. It didn't take long to uncover a recurring payment from Richard to V. Thorne Investigations. She dialed the number, her heart pounding as she stepped into the shadowed corner of the rose garden. "Thorne," a gruff voice answered. "My name is Anelise Parker, or Juliet Sterling," she said softly. "You were hired by my uncle to investigate me. That's confidential client information." "I know what you found," she pressed, her voice gaining strength. "You discovered the yacht accident wasn't an accident. I found letters in from my governess Fiona, warning my father about Richard. He told you to bury it, didn't he?" A pause, longer this time. "You're playing a dangerous game, Miss Sterling." "Richard is the one playing a dangerous game," she shot back. "He tried to frame me for theft. I think he's responsible for my parents' deaths. I need your help. I need to find Fiona." Thorne said nothing for nearly a minute. The silence stretched heavy with calculation. Crossing a man like Richard Sterling could end his career, or his life. But this young woman's courage, combined with his evidence, was something even Richard couldn't fully bury. "Finding a ghost who's been gone for 24 years isn't easy," he said finally. "Or cheap. My grandmother just created a trust for me. I can pay whatever you ask." "It's not about money anymore," Thorne said, his tone darkening. "Richard Sterling made a mistake when he asked me to bury a murder. Send me copies of the letters. I'll find your governess." Juliet ended the call and looked back toward the mansion, a fortress of marble and secrets. It was her inheritance, her home, and her curse. Richard had struck first, and missed, but now she had allies. A detective who couldn't forget. A ghost named Fiona who still spoke from the grave. And a truth buried deep enough to kill for, but not deep enough to stay hidden forever. Anelise knew Richard wouldn't stop. His next strike would be darker, more deliberate. Finding Fiona wasn't just about uncovering the past anymore. It was about surviving the present. Vincent Thorne, a master at finding the lost and forgotten, began the hunt. He traced Fiona McLeod, the elusive governess, through a defunct high-end agency. After locating its retired owner, he discovered her only emergency contact, a distant cousin in Vermont. The woman was hesitant to talk, until Thorne showed her a photo of Anelise, her sterling dove birthmark visible. The cousin's expression softened. Fiona had told her to expect the woman with the mark. Fiona was alive, living under an assumed name in a quiet coastal cottage in Maine, hiding from ghosts far more dangerous than memory. Anelise knew she couldn't face this alone. She went to Beatrice, laying out everything: Fiona's letters, the cut beacon wires, Thorne's findings, and the truth that the governess still lived. The matriarch's face drained of color. To imagine her own son capable of betrayal was almost unbearable. But beneath the grief, her old strength returned. She would not allow her family's empire to stand on lies and blood. The confrontation was staged with cold precision inside Sterling Manor's grand library. Beatrice summoned Richard for an urgent family meeting, knowing his paranoia and pride would guarantee he came. He entered with his usual arrogance until the side door opened. An elderly woman stepped inside, her eyes haunted but clear. "Hello, Richard," Fiona said quietly. Richard froze. "You," he whispered as if seeing a ghost. At Beatrice's command, Fiona began to speak. Her voice trembled, but her words were steady, a dam of silence finally breaking. She described the vicious arguments between Richard and Edward, how Edward had uncovered their father Gregory's criminal dealings and planned to use them to free himself from the family's grasp. "Your brother saw it as betrayal," she said. "He believed Edward's departure would destroy the legacy he worshipped." Then her voice dropped to a whisper. She had seen Richard near the yacht the night before the trip, carrying a tool bag. Edward, knowing danger was near, had given her a safe deposit key, along with documents exposing the Sterling corruption and a final plea. "Protect my daughter. Don't let my family raise her." Tears filled Fiona's eyes as she described the desperate flight that followed. The storm, the chaos, and her decision to leave the infant Juliet on the steps of a church, hoping anonymity would save her. When she finished, the room was silent. Then Thorne stepped forward, his gravelly voice confirming the rest. The yacht's emergency beacon wires were cut cleanly. It wasn't an accident. All eyes turned to Richard. "It wasn't an accident, was it?" Beatrice's voice was calm, almost sorrowful. "You didn't kill your brother, you just let him die. You let the storm finish what your ambition began." Richard's bluster faltered. His denials crumbled into silence. And then, a slump of his shoulders. That was his confession. The empire he'd worshipped had devoured him at last. The aftermath wasn't a scene of shouting or vengeance, only quiet ruin. Beatrice chose private justice over public scandal. Richard was stripped of his position and exiled to a remote estate. For a man defined by control, obscurity was the cruelest punishment of all. The sterling fortune was restructured. Together, Beatrice and Anelise created the Edward and Laura Sterling Foundation, a vast trust dedicated to the arts and to integrity, the values Edward had fought for. Portion of the estate was placed in a personal trust for Juliet Sterling, enough to grant her independence and fulfill her father's final wish, but wealth didn't interest her. Her first act wasn't to buy luxury, it was to save her brother. Daniel received the best medical care money could buy, and within months his health returned. Watching him breathe easily for the first time in years became her greatest reward. Life at Sterling Manor slowly softened. Beatrice and Anelise forged a fragile but genuine bond, two women bound by love, loss, and the shared hope of redemption. Fiona, too, found peace. She gave Anelise the gift of memory, stories of the parents she'd never known, laughter lost to the sea, and a promise finally kept. One quiet afternoon, Anelise stood by the window, sunlight glinting off the faint silver mark on her arm, the sterling dove. It had guided her through lies, danger, and heartbreak, straight to the truth. That mark, once a mystery, had led her not just to her past but to her purpose. It had brought her home, not to the cold marble halls of wealth, but to a life defined by compassion, courage, and choice. The Sterling legacy was reborn, no longer built on power or deceit, but on the strength to face the truth and rebuild from its ashes. Anelise's journey reminds us that truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds its way to the surface. Family isn't defined by bloodlines or fortune, but by the love and choices that endure. Her scar was never a flaw. It was a key, unlocking her past and freeing her future. What began in a small diner ended with the transformation of a dynasty, proof that one person's courage can rewrite history.